believe in the ripple effect.
What's up? I'm back. Another episode of the Ripple Effect Podcast. I'm your host, Ricardo Brandes, also known as Ricky Brandes, and a great episode for you today. I love these type of episodes when I finally get a chance to chat with somebody that I've been a fan of for a very long time. And his name is Robb Wolf. He is a health and nutrition expert, best-selling author, documentary filmmaker, jiu-jitsu brown belt, also started one of the first CrossFit gyms in the US, and has a great new product line called Element, which is a electrolyte supplement. And as you guys probably know, I do a ketovore type of diet and I fast most days. So typically I only eat one, sometimes 2 meals a day, but typically only one. And when you're only eating once a day, it's hard to stay hydrated, especially when you're having nothing but coffee and water all day. So you're not having any food that might have sodium or potassium that's going to help you sustain some of that water. So these electrolyte products are awesome. Look for the ones that don't have any sugar, which is why I love Robb Wolf's new supplement. He uses stevia leaf extract. So it's a great alternative to sugar. It tastes good. It hydrates you. And it might be helpful if you're dealing with some keto flu symptoms or struggling to drink water in the winter. It's a great alternative to water and it's a healthy alternative. I also highly recommend his documentary, Sacred Cow, which I believe is available everywhere. It's a great documentary about food, nutrition, the environment, food's impact on the environment, farming, some of the propaganda behind the anti-meat movement, and much more. And as you can guess, we talk a lot about nutrition, health, exercise, paleo diet, keto diet, carnivore diet, autoimmune diseases, all that stuff and much more. And of course, as you can also guess, we do get into the COVID topic and his opinions on many things related to that. So hold on tightly. It's an amazing, amazing conversation with a lot of information. But I can't let you go without reminding you guys, this is a value for value show. If you get some value out of this conversation or any of my podcasts, please, please, please consider supporting my show, supporting my work, supporting this passion project, and helping me reach the goal of eventually doing this full time. And all these methods of supporting the show you can find in the show description if you're listening to the audio version of the podcast. But if you can't find them, go to therippleeffectpodcast.com, click on support, and you'll find links to all the ways you can help support the show. And some of the ways are, we have a Patreon page. If you can support me on Patreon, once a month I do a Patreon podcast exclusively with my Patreon supporters. So that's always fun, and it's a great way of connecting with myself and other listeners. I have a PayPal account if you want to donate that way. I have a crypto wallet if you want to send crypto. And also I have a merch store, and I have some new art that I'm very close to releasing in the merch store. But check out the merch store. We have hats, hoodies, we have mugs, tons of cool stuff, and all that money goes to supporting the Ripple Effect Podcast. And like I said, you can find all this at therippleeffectpodcast.com. Click on the support tab, or counting on where you're watching or listening to this, you might be able to get the link directly in the show description. And of course, if you can't support the show financially, don't worry about it. The most important thing is getting these shows out there. I'm fighting against censorship and the algorithms that don't want you to find my show. So please share the show, review the show, thumbs up the show, tell people about the show, and that goes a long way. And the last announcement is, as you guys know, you can find the video version of this podcast on many different platforms, which you can find in the show description, or you can find all the links on my website. But soon you'll also be able to find the Ripple Effect Podcast on Iconic and on Band.video. We're in the process of uploading the archives to Band.video. You can find the link to our Band.video channel on my website or in the show description. These conversations are important, and I will post this show on any platform that lets me, and just trying to reach as many people as possible. So thank you everybody for the support. Thank you so much for always being patient and always supporting my work, regardless if I put out one show a week or if I put out 3 shows a week. And life has been a little crazy of late, which is why I haven't released as many episodes as I would like of late. But I love the fact that I have loyal listeners who really appreciate the show and stick around regardless how many episodes I release or how often I release them. Thanks again, guys. Enjoy this conversation, and I'll talk to you guys on the next one. Peace. So for people who are listening who aren't familiar with some of your background and how you got into the whole nutrition and health and exercise world, what is some of your origin story?
Oh man, I'll try to keep it brief. I was a biochemist by training, was doing bench research in the areas of cancer and autoimmunity, and was looking at either going into mainstream medical degree process, maybe an MD, PhD. And right around that time, and this was 1996, 1997, I got super sick. I developed ulcerative colitis so bad that I was facing a bowel resection, pretty dire health situation. I'm about 175 pounds right now. I got down to 125 pounds from malabsorption with the ulcerative colitis. So if you imagine 50 pounds less of me, like it was pretty serious. It's a long, convoluted story how I figured, came to a paleo or ancestral type diet as a solution for that. But I eventually did, and it was pretty magical for me. And it was so transformative that it made me realize I really didn't want to do standard medical practice, because I was facing 4 years of medical school, 4 years of residency, then specialization, and all of this stuff focused on kind of catastrophic healthcare. And I knew that what I needed to do was help people, eat better, sleep better, move, have community, and that was the type of stuff I wanted to do. But I wasn't totally sure how to make that happen. And it was now a few years later, 2000, 2001, I was poking around on the interwebs and I found this weird workout called CrossFit. And I started doing that with my friend Dave Warner, who's a retired Navy SEAL. And we converted his garage into a home gym. And within about 3-4 months, we had like 15 people that we were training in there. And I reached out to Greg and Lauren Glassman, the founders of CrossFit, and said, hey, we want to formally open a gym. We want to call it CrossFit. Can we do that? And they were like, yes, do it. And so that was the first CrossFit affiliate gym in the world, CrossFit North. And then I had an opportunity to move back down to Chico, California, which is where I did my undergrad. And so I did that. I kind of like this fiery orb in the sky called the sun, and you don't get a lot of that in Seattle. And so I opened a gym there called CrossFit NorCal Strength and Conditioning. That was the 4th affiliate gym. And, I worked in and around the CrossFit scene for a number of years, got to work with just tens of thousands of people, ended up doing things like being on the Navy SEAL, Naval Special Warfare Resiliency Program, when I spoke to the SEAL teams, the special boat teams, their families about sleep, food, basically resilience, sleep, food, circadian biology, just overall better health. And so I've been able to work with everything from Olympic athletes to elite level military personnel, but really my sweet spot is helping people like myself who have both autoimmune and gut metabolic related issues. So some people in health and fitness get known for like diamond hard abs and glutes and everything. I'm kind of the poop guy, like I'm the poop expert. So that's a 23 years of career kind of condensed down into, I don't know, 3 minutes, something like that.
Well, it's funny how many people actually have gut issues and aren't even aware that a lot of their either them being bloated or food making them nauseous or caffeine making them nauseous is all this gut health issue. They think it's just digestive, it's just hereditary, it's unfixable. And I had some gut issues. First time in my life, it was like a couple years ago, and it was I still didn't put my finger on exactly what caused it. I don't know if it was caffeine on an empty stomach, what was it, maybe neglecting probiotics and enzymes and stuff for so long. But it cognitively, I was kind of stunned by the way it affected me.
Mhm.
and your motivation. Like, it's just, I mean, obviously the mind body connection is real, and that wisdom of that saying, I have a gut feeling, that kind of makes you think, okay, maybe they knew something. And it does seem like over and over again there was some old wisdom lost that we're rediscovering, that it's like, oh shit, we got it all wrong and they had it right, and we just have to rediscover how they made it work. But throughout you got into the keto diet. Did you look into diet nutrition to fix some of those issues, and which diets, because you messed around with a couple of them, right? You were a vegan for a little bit, right?
Yeah, I mean, being vegan is what got me sick, and it may work for other people, but it was a catastrophic failure for me. And I mean, I had gone to like the Georgia Shawa Macrobiotic Institute. I was a biochemist. I was very committed to this stuff, and just for me, it really didn't work. I have celiac disease. My mom died from some complications from celiac and rheumatoid arthritis, so that's an autoimmune reaction to gluten and gluten-like proteins. And for me, it's and for a lot of people, what they discover is that there's a good number of plant-based materials that they just don't do well with, and gluten is one of these common things. Corn is another one. Some people don't do well with dairy. A lot of people don't do particularly well with eggs, but this ancestral health or paleo diet kind of template is what I ultimately kind of stumbled onto. And Lauren Cordain, who's kind of the guy who really put the paleo diet initially on the map. His book called The Paleo Diet was released in 2001. He had a paper called Cereal Grains, Mankind's Double-Edged Sword. And it talked about how civilization probably wouldn't have occurred had we not developed agriculture and domesticated both plants and animals and whatnot. And so there's clearly some potential upside there, but some of the downside is some really significant health problems. And it was interesting because it talked a lot about this gut autoimmune complex that tends to occur within these, what we would call Neolithic foods, like the grains, legumes, and dairy. So, I mean, it's kind of funny. Folks will say, well, you bounced around with different stuff. My first New York Times bestselling book was The Paleo Solution. And in that book, I recommended adequate protein, low carb, paleo type diet. And then as time went on, my second book, Wired to Eat, which focused a lot on a ketogenic diet, was an adequate protein, low carb, paleo based deal. I mean, it's been effectively the same as a beginning point. Like if you're playing darts, it's like, of course we want to hit the bullseye, but the bullseye for each person individually is different, but this minimally processed, adequate protein, low glycemic load approach to eating gets most people like 85% to the bullseye. And then some people may need a lot more carbs. Some people may need fewer. Some people need something like a carnivore diet where they really don't do well with, plant material at all. But that beginning process of just focusing on protein for satiety, for nutrient density, whatever plant material we're looking at, trying to think about the glycemic load, like how much carbohydrate load and insulin response we get from it, and think about some of the satiety features. Like when we eat this way, do we tend to, I suspect that part of the reason you are able to do intermittent fasting in the way that you do is the qualitative nature of the food that you eat. Like if you ate garbage food, it would probably make it harder to make it that full 24-hour period before needing to eat again, versus like kind of a minimally processed lower carb type diet. So those have been kind of the big picture framework. And the struggle that I've faced is having simple heuristics, like simple rules for people to follow, so that we can just get them going. But then people want to turn those simple guidelines into religious doctrine. And then when person A is different than person B, then they think that there's something, weird going on, because there should be like this one size fits all approach. And it just doesn't work that way, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, that's the thing that we have to take in consideration. I think a lot of diets are they become cultish because, and I don't think it's always bad. I think it's a lot of times it's for moral reasons. It's because if something works for me and it's improved my life and I feel better physically and mentally, I want to share that information. I want to help people get rid of their joint pain. I want people to have more energy to play with their kids and go out and do the things they're motivated to do. So it's and that's why I think I say this all the time on the show. Some of the diet and nutrition shows I've done throughout in the past, like Dr. Dominic D'Agostino and all the people, like I feel like they're the most important, not because any specific reason, but more just because it's something people can listen to and hopefully they can implement immediately. And it doesn't matter which diet it is. I've had Sean Baker on and others, and I did the carnivore diet for 3 weeks, and I actually really enjoyed the way I felt and the way I looked, because you do lean up, but it was just a little too boring eating steak and eggs every day. And
right.
And I love steak and eggs, but you talk about all the time, palate fatigue is a real thing, and you get bored, and you just eventually, like, I don't know. I mean, I'm one of those people that do whatever works for you, but there are some basic guidelines that just about helps everybody. And that, like you said, that's removing grains, processed foods, sugar. It's like everybody kind of agrees on that you should. So it's like focus on that and like take baby steps, and then hopefully, because I think too many people try to change their diets overnight, and it's like sometimes that's too hard. And some people can do it. Like I love having those discipline, like just journeys where I'm like, okay, can I mentally do this diet for 2 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever it may be, and I'm like, okay, it's a discipline exercise, it's a mental discipline exercise. But some people, they'll fold, they'll go really hard, and then they'll just completely give up on it. So there is something about baby steps. Now your movie Sacred Cow, which I love, and it really hits home because I was born in Portugal, in northern Portugal, on a farm. My parents are farmers. We live in Massachusetts now, but you go to their backyard, you feel like you're still in Portugal because there's chickens all over the place. And we went to local butcher shops. My cousins own a local butcher shop, so I grew up going to watching the meat being cut and being not disconnected from where our food comes from. And to me, it's completely normal. I remember friends coming to my house when I lived with my parents and seeing walking in the garage. My brother and I played in a band. We would go to band practice in the garage, and we'd turn on the lights, and there's a giant pig hanging upside down, and it would freak out. And I'm like, oh, it's just food. I'm like, what are you guys freaking out about?
Right.
So I think there is something about a disconnect with where our food comes from and whatnot. But what was your goal with Sacred Cow, which is a book and a film, and you can find it, if people are listening, you can find it on YouTube, you can rent it, buy it, it's on Amazon. I've seen it at a bunch of different places, so definitely check it out. But what was your goal, and what was your motivation to be a part of that project?
Oh man, looking back, it was career suicide. Like I was just done doing this stuff, so I'm like, I might as well, like pour gasoline on myself and set myself on fire. But I think it was 2002 that I was having a discussion with the guy, and he was an ethical vegan, and we were talking about all just paleo and veganism and everything. And it was like, well, it takes so many resources to raise animals that you could otherwise feed to humans, which I was like, no, you just feed cows grass. Like, and yes, there is some finishing and that can occur and does occur. And actually a huge amount of what is fed to cattle is completely inedible to humans. It's grain products that are used to make alcohol, and then it's the leftover products of alcohol production that are then fed to cattle. Even CAFO, confined area feedlot organization, like the beef that you get in Costco and Walmart and all that stuff, it spends 70% of its life on grass. And then the bulk of the finishing time, there is some grain that's given that in theory could be fed to humans, but the bulk of it is like crop residues and things that are completely inedible to humans. And it's either going to oxidize, or it could get turned into food and also be turned back into fertilizer and whatnot. And so I was having this discussion with this guy, and he it was interesting when I started laying this stuff out. It was almost like sitting down with a child and explaining basic ecology. And I'm not saying that to like demean the person, but he'd been raised his whole life in Seattle. He had never even like been to a farm, you know, and I wasn't a farmer as a kid, but my extended family, my aunts, uncles, they had horses, they had cows, they had chickens, you know, I mean, they slaughtered cows and pork, you know, pigs and everything. And I just saw that stuff and I kind of understood like, okay, the table scraps from these three families go out to the pigs and the chickens, and there's this like kind of cyclical deal to it. And my grandmother had this enormous garden, and the areas where the cows and horses were moved around, us kids would go with wheelbarrows and go scoop up all the manure and then stick it in my grandmother's garden. And then my uncle would get a rototiller and rototill it into the ground. And, you know, so I had a pretty good sense of, you know, kind of this cyclic nature to food production. This guy was just completely divorced from that, you know, and it was actually, it was over the course of a couple of weeks about us talking about this stuff. He was like, huh, okay, like I kind of get this, you know, and I'm still kind of off put by the idea that we need to kill something to eat it, but I understand this kind of cyclical thing. And we started talking just about like nature, you know, like if you have bison on a prairie and there's, you know, if you don't have wolves to maintain a population, then the bison outstrip the carrying capacity of the area, and then the population crashes, and, you know, and on and on and on. So that was around 2002. And then 2006, I was invited to speak at this thing at California State University, Chico. There was a local food co-op that had decided to begin selling meat. And the funny thing, their charter had always been that they would not sell meat, but a Trader Joe's had moved to town, and they were just getting beat to death by Trader Joe's because everybody could get virtually everything they needed going to Trader Joe's versus the co-op. And a lot of the co-op customers were saying, hey, the one thing that I can't get here is meat. And so if you would carry meat, then I'll patronize you because you're the local people. But otherwise, you know, there's a convenience thing here. And there was the usual kind of like socialist outcry of, well, you should just do this and make it really inconvenient for yourself, even though, you know, this is one of the benefits of like market-based economies. People figure out what the needs of people are, and if they can meet it in a more direct way, then it tends to do well. But the long and short is that the directors of the co-op had already decided that they were going to sell meat, but what they wanted was a public debate so they could go through the theater of looking like there was going to be a discussion, but they had already made the decision. But I was on this kind of like pro meat side, and you can still find that one online. It's like the Great Meat Debate, you know, of California State University, Chico. And I was talking about these basic ecological things, you know, about sunlight, grass, grazing animals, food, upcycling nutrients. You know, I mean, it gets a little bit different when we get into the industrialized pork and chicken story, like which, funny enough, that's what most people are recommending that we shift towards, that we should eat less beef and more chicken. But chicken is 100% dependent on the confined area feedlot operation. It's soy and grains exclusively. And so it's funny, Leonardo DiCaprio has a film before the flood, and he goes through and talks about climate change. And I think actually in a very misrepresentative way, a sensationalist way, climate change is real. Climate change has problems that we're going to need to face. But I think the way that they're presenting it actually doesn't square with any of the science that's being put forward. But anyway, what at the end of it, his recommendation is eat less beef and more chicken. Which, if you're really buying into this like carbon footprint story and resource allocation, is literally 100% the opposite of what you should do. And there was no succinct counterpoint to this kind of planet of the vegan, position. And so Diana Rogers and I, who Diana's my co-author and co-producer in the film, man, when was it? It must have been maybe 2014. We really decided, we knew that we were going to have to do like a book, and then later the film became kind of obvious because not everybody's going to want to read a book on this. But we try to tackle the health, environmental, and ethical considerations of a meat-inclusive food system. When we try to answer these big questions, we see claims that grazing animals and beef production accounts for 78% of greenhouse gas emissions. Like, this is something that's been thrown out there. Is that true? And when you really dig into it, it's not remotely true. Beef production accounts for less than 2% of total greenhouse gas emissions out of the United States and also at a global level. And something that's missed in that is that is part of a cycle. The methane and the carbon dioxide that is released from these animals living was carbon dioxide that was pulled out of the atmosphere, became part of a plant, and then was eaten and is part of the carbon cycle. Now, you can't just neglect that wholesale, but if you start vilifying biogenic carbon sources, then things like termites are dangerous and shellfish are dangerous. There was a paper in the journal, the website physics.org, that was talking about how scientists have discovered that shellfish produce monumental amounts of methane. And part of this, the suggestion there was maybe we need to eradicate shellfish. So we're in this insane spot where people are saying we need to destroy this life on the planet to ensure that this other life on the planet goes forward. And it's so counter to like biodiversity and ecology, and is just really divorced from like the basic physics and this whole crazy arcane topic within physics called non-equilibrium thermodynamics, which is talking about like we want as much life as possible, because the more life on the planet we have, the more stable the ecosystem is. So these are all the things that we needed to talk about in this book and to some degree in the film, to just get to like a square one, having a conversation around this topic, because there had been no good. There are some great books like In Defense of Beef and some other books, and they do a really good job, but it tends to be very narrow in focus. And so we tried to cover all of these things, because what we had noticed is when we start having a discussion around this stuff, I call it the vegan whack-a-mole game. So somebody will say meat causes cancer. Okay, so we get in and we start unpacking. Does meat cause cancer? And we get to this point and it's like, no, probably not. Science is very, very weak on this. There's a lot of confounders, and then they shift gears. Okay, well, meat's terrible for the environment. Well, okay, now we'll get in and start talking about the environment. And it's maybe even more complex than the health topic, but we ultimately get to this spot where, okay, meat isn't the bugaboo that it's being made out to be. So then the person says, well, it's unethical to eat meat. Okay, now we need to have an ethical discussion. So it's this whack-a-mole game where whenever you start engaging folks on this, they just change the narrative as the thing progresses. So you have to kind of tackle all of it. So what we ended up doing was integrating the ethical, environmental, and health considerations and tied them all together in a way that no one could exist without the other. And at the end of the day, we make a pretty compelling case that it's arguable that it's impossible to have adequate human health, a healthy planet, and the most ethical food production system without animals. And that's kind of the end thesis that we have on that.
Yeah, well, the thing about doing that, I've been doing this podcast since 2013. I've always been, my whole life, I've always been attracted to people that just shatter my worldview, and it's happened many of times where just like, wait, we've been told that this is right and this is true over and over again, and nobody ever questions like, hey, has anybody really looked into this, or is it based on fuzzy science? And when you look at like the cholesterol myth. And I call it a myth because for a long time, eating cholesterol and fats were all why people were having heart attacks, even though a majority of people who have heart attacks have average cholesterol levels,
right?
And all these, these other things. And I remember the first time I heard that, I'm like, wait, what? There might be something here. And then, Mark Sisson, yourself, like I said, CJ Hunt, all these people that I was discovering, Dr. Chris Kresher, that I'm just like, wow, man, this is me making me rethink this over and over again. And it's stunning how something can be repeated and adopted into your worldview, and yet it's incorrect. And then you get into Gary Taubes, and just one thing you learn about the whole health nutrition world is how how unscientific a lot of science is out there, and how
Right.
and Gary Taubes was like a perfect example. His whole story with the case against sugar, with he was told like, hey, you want to find some really fuzzy science, go into the nutrition world, and you're going to find some really fuzzy science. So for people listening who are saying, hey, if you're promoting eating more meat, shouldn't I be concerned about my cholesterol levels? Should I be concerned if you're saying, hey, we need more electrolytes and sodium? Should I be concerned about my blood pressure? What do you say to people like that? And of course, like we said initially, obviously everybody's different and things will affect people differently. But in general, this what's the evidence that dietary cholesterol really leads to heart attacks? What's the evidence that sodium is going to lead to blood pressure? Is there something there that we should really think about, or how much of it's bad science?
Yeah. So the cholesterol topic, we'll kind of parse that out. So there's kind of two pieces to that. There's like consuming cholesterol, and that would have some influence on our circulating cholesterol levels. And that Ansel Keys, back in the late 1950s, 1960s, he's the person that kind of put the diet heart hypothesis forward and kind of launched us into a lot of this low fat paradigm. He said that there was no link between dietary cholesterol intake and like cardiovascular disease and circulating cholesterol levels. Like there's this thing that every couple of years, eating one egg is equivalent to smoking a pack of cigarettes because of the amount of cholesterol. And we have some very nicely conducted studies where they feed people eggs and their cholesterol levels don't go up. And so, and so part of this is that our body very tightly regulates the production of cholesterol. And if we consume cholesterol from the diet, then it doesn't produce as much cholesterol endogenously, where we take other protein, carbs, fats, and use those to build tinker like Lincoln log style cholesterol. Now I'm in kind of an interesting spot. I'm on the board of directors of a lipidology clinic, so we look at very high level cardiovascular disease risk, and we did a pilot program with the Reno Police and Fire Departments 10 years ago where we found people at high risk for type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. We put those folks on a lower carb paleo type diet, modified their sleep and exercise based off the changes in the lipidology work that we had with these people and their basic physical. It's estimated that pilot study saved the city of Reno about $22 million with a 33-to-1 return on investment. So I have a little bit of, I'm not a lipidologist, I'm not a doctor, but I'm pretty good at that stuff, particularly for someone who, isn't like board certified in it. The cholesterol and lipoprotein story is interesting in that there are people in the low carb world that just want to insist that so long as your insulin levels are low, you are protected from cardiovascular disease. And I think that that's false. But then there are people who will see like a cholesterol and a lipoprotein. And just to back up a little bit, we have cholesterol, which is a molecule that it is easier to track chemically. Like the reason why we've been looking at cholesterol for the last 50 years is it's relatively easy to track via lab work. There are these things called lipoproteins, which are the actual particles that carry cholesterol through the body. So we have like LDL cholesterol that is carried by low density lipoprotein cholesterol. LDL, that is the low density lipoprotein. HDL, high density lipoprotein. So these are the little molecules that carry things throughout the body. And you could think about lipoproteins like a vehicle, and cholesterol like passengers in a vehicle. So you could have a bus, which is a one vehicle with a lot of passengers on it, or a motorcycle, still one vehicle with only like one passenger in it. And this ends up being kind of important for cardiovascular disease risk. But we could have two people with the same cholesterol level, the same lipoprotein level. Both of them are a little high. Like they're a little higher than maybe what we might like. One person eats low carb, they have low blood sugars, normal low blood sugars. They have normal low blood pressure. They have rock bottom systemic inflammatory markers, and their cardiovascular disease risk is going to be different than the person with the same cholesterol and lipoprotein levels who is peri-diabetic, high average blood glucose, high systemic inflammation, and elevated blood pressure. So this is, I think that it's a multifactorial story. I really, really wish that kind of the Gary Taubes-esque, it's all insulin is the whole thing. I really wish that was the story, because it'd be much simpler to unpack. But I think it's more detailed and nuanced than that. So I'm in this spot where like I make everybody angry. Like the low carb jihadis are angry at me because they just want to believe that so long as they never see their insulin level bump up, and they'll even avoid eating protein for fear of stimulating mTOR insulin release. And these people have no muscle mass, and if their car slid off of an icy road, they would die there because they have no physical capacity to like save themselves because they're so avoiding protein and strength training and everything. But then there's this other side that I would say kind of more the vegan, and I'm not going to call it plant-based because I think that's just a mealy mouth thing to call it, the vegan centric model, which is that you're safe so long as your cholesterol is lower than anything else. But there's a trade-off. People with low cholesterol levels, if they get sepsis, like if they get a serious infection, they die from it more. They're more likely to die from neurodegenerative disease, or more likely to die from various types of cancer. So everything in biology is a trade-off. And part of the trade-off that we have with, cholesterol and lipoproteins, it's part of our innate immune response. And so if the innate immune response helps us with bacteria and viral infections, it also it helps with clearing different types of early stage cancers. So that's a benefit. And so that could be good. But then if you are predisposed to cardiovascular disease, have elevated lipoproteins and cholesterol, also have hypertension and some systemic inflammatory markers, and high average blood glucose, then it may end up being bad, because it may net increase your likelihood of like a stroke or a heart attack. So I sound almost more mainstream now at this point than a lot of people like in the ancestral health space, but I think that there's just a massive spectrum within all this, and it's not. So shit, how long have we been talking about this? Like at least like 5 to 7 minutes, right? And I've done an incredibly superficial treatment of lipoproteins and cardiovascular disease risk. When I interview my friend, Dr. Bill Cromwell, he has a PhD in physics, and then also he's an MD. And then he's one of the world's leading lipidologists, and him talking for 5 minutes about this stuff, I'm hard pressed to keep up with him. It's like, Bill, I followed, 30 seconds of the last 4 minutes and 30 seconds, 4 minutes that you were talking, and we've done a completely slapdick treatment of cardiovascular disease risk, and it was still 5 minutes, and there's still all this like nuance and everything. So people want these like soundbite, newsworthy pieces, and there's just situations where it's hard to spit that out. And so I don't know if I did a great job unpacking the, kind of cholesterol, cardiovascular disease thing. But for sure, the one thing that I'm pretty emphatic about is dietary cholesterol intake for the vast majority of people has virtually no impact on circulating cholesterol levels. There is a subset of people for which that is not true, that dietary cholesterol intake directly impacts, circulating cholesterol levels. Because of course there needs to be one genetic outlier out there that screws up that thing, but so we have that. And then like on the sodium level, it's or the sodium topic, sodium is important in hypertension and high blood pressure. But the thing is that when we put people on low sodium diets, it doesn't really bring down the blood pressure. It does a little bit, but not that much. And the reason why is that the elevated blood pressure is primarily driven by elevated chronic insulin levels. So hyperinsulinemia tends to cause an elevation in this hormone called aldosterone, Aldosterone causes the kidneys to retain sodium. And when we retain sodium, then we tend to have elevated blood pressure levels. I would also mention, though, that people tend to get the bulk of their sodium from highly processed diets. That's what, there was a report, back a couple of months, I think, before Christmas. It was something like 78%, 68% of calories consumed by Americans are from highly processed, hyperpalatable foods, like what they would call ultra processed foods, like basically a Slurpee. Like it's the equivalent of like a Slurpee, maybe with like beef jerky in it or something like that.
Well,
like it's like
a snack, right? Okay.
Yeah, it's just garbage, and it's like 78% of the food that people are eating is considered like what would have been a TV dinner of my youth would have been minimally processed compared to the crap that people are eating now. And there's a mountain of sodium in that. So there's a lot of sodium, but what's missing in those meals is potassium and magnesium. And I'm actually looking at a great study here. Let me pull this thing up. Higher intakes of potassium and magnesium, but not lower sodium, reduce cardiovascular disease risk in the Framingham offspring study. And so it's a really fascinating piece. It is a epidemiological, like, correlational study. It's not a randomized control trial, but we've had randomized control trials where we will just make sure that people get adequate magnesium and potassium, and then they can eat kind of whatever sodium they want, and they don't have elevated blood pressure. So I think the blood pressure story is more junk food, junk carbs, and because of the junk food and junk carbs, people are not getting adequate magnesium and potassium. And so the sodium is kind of like, it doesn't really matter one way or the other, as long as you get adequate magnesium and potassium. The way you get adequate magnesium and potassium is not eating so much processed food. When we eat less processed food, we don't eat as much sodium by extension, and you may actually then need more sodium, which is part of the reason why we ended up developing this element product. Is that, particularly with athletes, like, we just noticed that people, benefited from increasing their sodium intake. And again, I know that was like a very like shotgun approach to addressing that. But again, like, sodium, good or bad? It's like, well, there's a lot of context to it, a lot of nuance. Yeah.
Well, that's the thing about a lot of these topics. They're not simple, right? And
right.
There, like we said before, there's some rules that I think most people would agree on, but there's a lot of nuances once you really start dissecting, getting below the surface. I do see it seems like a link, and that might have explained it, a link between like people that I know that are diabetics who also have a high blood pressure. That seems like, they go hand in hand a little bit. And and then the processed food thing, it's interesting because one thing I keep saying about the carnivore diet to friends of mine and people I talk to is how I don't think it's because, and even though I love red meat and it's probably the majority of what I eat still, I don't think it's specifically because red meat's some special miracle food. I think a lot of it is because we're eliminating all these other things that aren't good for you.
What is it you're not eating then?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's I think a big part of why people have success with it. You look at like Jordan Peterson and people who have autoimmune issues, his daughter, and they've had great success with the carnivore diet. And I think that's a huge part of it, is just what are you eliminating? What are you not eating? We don't realize, like, a lot of what we eat isn't really food. It's just like chemicals. What was that book, The Dorito Effect, right? Or something.
Right. Yeah. Mark Schatzker. Yeah. Great book.
Yeah, they know how to just pull at your desires and wants and create this artificial, which kind of, that's scary because everything's going to be artificial at some point, which is scary.
Right.
But
here's just a really quick, in on that. What is like what's the hope for the future of food? It's like Impossible Burger and meat in a vat and all this type of stuff. That is uber processed food. Like you're taking grain and legume products, ultra processing it. It's very unhealthy. When it's been fed to animal models, the animals get sick, like really, really sick. And this gets into a lot of weeds, and like I would want, maybe someday we do a follow-up podcast and I can bring references for this stuff, because I'm going to throw some stuff out there that's like conspiracy theory, but it's like, no, it's very easily documented. but one of the stated goals of the folks in this kind of fake food movement, which ironically is really supported by the vegans, is that folks want to run our food system like software. They want it to be intellectual property that can be owned. And
it's
this
not a
is
conspiracy theory. I mean, well, this is the right show for this conversation because I had Dr. Robert Malone and Peter McCullough on.
Okay, yeah.
So I'm all for diving deep into these topics because I think the scary thing is when people actually look into it, it's there's a lot of evidence there. It's not just based on, and I think we're realizing that, or not us maybe, but a lot of the average population is realizing that a lot of stuff that was dismissed as crazy, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, is now being implemented or pushed. And people are like, okay, maybe I should start, rethinking why Bill Gates owns, so much farmland and why, all these other really weird things that maybe I didn't think there was much there. And now, maybe I should start taking a little more seriously.
Right. Yeah. And so the crazy position that I'm recommending is that we decentralize our food system, that developing countries not be beholden to the United States and Europe for their farm exports, that they should, if we do trade, great. But what's happening is that there are attempts to basically supplant traditional food systems and get these developing countries in different, stretches of the world dependent on the outputs of our industrial row crop food system. And Forbes had a fascinating piece that basically made the case that, the vegan movement is like the best thing that ever happened to big food because it's all just processed shit. Like they're not championing, pearl barley and soaked sprouted legumes. It's all, not all, but a significant chunk of it is going into like these fake meat products, which is a whole interesting irony there. People who eat meat are not trying to turn meat into like carrots and broccoli. So, it's just kind of fascinating that even though meat is supposed to be this horrible, terrible thing, we're doing everything that we can, bending the rules of chemistry and physics to try to do what nature already does for us, which is turn plant material into meat.
And what percentage of plants are even edible? I mean, people don't like, that's why when people think about the carnivore diet and their initial reaction is that's crazy. And I'm like, wait, we've been eating animal products for forever. And it's like, well, how is that any more crazy than being on a vegetarian diet where there's a small percentage of plants that we actually can eat, right?
Yeah, and it's, and this I don't know if this really helps. Like for me, it's interesting, but we have examples of people that have eaten nothing but meat for decades, and they live just fine. They don't suffer scurvy, they don't suffer any type of malabsorption issues and whatnot. You can't do that on any type of a vegan diet, and that's eating multiple plants. But if you were to just eat rice, just eat corn, just eat watermelon, like maybe the closest, the thing that would keep you alive the longest, one of the most nutritionally well-rounded items is like a white potato is pretty good, but you're going to die from nutrient deficiencies at some point. And that's if you eat a singular, vegan item, or if you eat a multitude of vegan items. Like you have to supplement either with animal products or with some sort of concentrated vitamin mix, whether it's B12 or zinc or iron or what have you. So, yeah, I mean, it is interesting that we have tracts of the world that eat almost nothing but rice, almost nothing but corn, almost nothing but wheat. And we don't really bat an eye at that. But then it seems weird that, particularly if somebody, I think it's kind of, these 18 to 24-year-old dudes that are like, I'm going to go carnivore to get jacked. And it's like, there's probably a lot of things you could do before that to improve both health and performance, but whatever. But you have somebody that has run the gauntlet of modern medicine, and they have gut and autoimmune issues, they have complex neurological issues, depression or whatever, and they've just done everything, and there's nothing else. And then they see some people like a Jordan Peterson who is like, well, I have literally nothing left to lose, and they give it a shot and it works. Like you have like a 30 35 to 50-year-old person who, I think by and large, we don't, like I did a similar thing with the carnivore deal. Like gave it a shot. I'm like, this is cool. I love steak, but goddamn, if I wouldn't like to just have a sprig of asparagus here and there, or, like a slice of watermelon, and I guess some people like Sean Baker, like I love Sean, like he's one of my favorite people in this space, but he's like, I don't want any of that stuff. I'm like, cool. I would, slit someone's throat to have like a piece of watermelon, 1 week into carnivore, and I don't know what that says, but it's, my point there, I guess, is that people will shit talk people like Jordan and his daughter and some of the other folks that have gone carnivore. This isn't where folks wanted to be. You don't, other than when you're like this youngster and you're on social media and you're trying to get all the likes and, spin the algorithm so that you get popular online and everything, you when you get old enough, you just don't give a fuck about any of that stuff. You just want to be happy and be healthy and live a good life and everything. And at that point, you also don't necessarily want to be constrained to like, I remember Jordan talking about, so he eats beef and it has to be only these certain cuts of beef. And then he has salt and then he has water. And he's gotten to the point where it's like water, hot, cold, or lukewarm, bubbly or not bubbly, because he's so looking for some amount of variety. So it's like one meal will be, steak, no salt, warm water to drink, steak, salt, warm water to drink. Oh man, that's totally fucking different because, steak, Himalayan salt, bubbly water, cold, think about that. And that doesn't prove that what these people are doing is right. It doesn't prove that it's right for everybody, but there should be a little bit of empathy for these folks where it's like, fuck, that's where they are. Like, that's what they need to do to be healthy. And again, maybe there's something that they could do. I don't know, but most of these people have tried everything else. They've tried turning over every other stone. And that's been one of the impressive things to me about the carnivore diet is that I coined the term the autoimmune paleo protocol. Like there have been studies on it. It's well documented now. There's several studies, like the Walls protocol is a spinoff of this. It's good. It's good stuff. And I think all of the autoimmune paleo stuff is inferior to these basic carnivore approaches for gut and autoimmune conditions. And it's simpler to do. At the end of the day, the problematic things always end up being plant material, other than maybe eggs and dairy for some folks. But, that's easy to address.
Well, it's funny. It reminds me of so George St. Pierre was on Lex Fridman's podcast and recently, and he was talking about how when he fasts, he'll have dinner with whoever his friends or family. And he's like, we'll all be eating the same thing. But because I haven't ate in 2 days, he's like, this same meal tastes better to me than all of you. And it's right. So it's like one of those things where you, even something as like cold water, you take it for granted because you have it all the time, so it's right. It brings pleasure to those simple. I think that's necessary these days, like just finding pleasure in the simple things. I think during the whole lockdown and COVID thing, it's something as simple as going to a restaurant and just being not, a lot of the food we can make at home, but being around other people, being at a place where people are there to get away from stresses and work and all the stuff. So there's a positive energy that's attractive to going out to eat. And we realized how much we needed that, and how and that social part is so important. That's something I want to talk to you a little bit about. I wanted to slowly tiptoe into the controversial topics, but sure. But as we have a lot of similarities, I think, in views. You're taking off the jacket. We're like, oh, we're going COVID. Let's.
Yeah. I'm warming up now. Yeah.
But I homeschooled my kids. I have a 6-year-old actually turning 7 in a couple weeks, son, and then I have a 5-year-old daughter, and we homeschooled. I'm a huge believer in in gym, being a part of my mental health as much as it's important for my physical health. Playing sports, same thing. I really look forward to, once or twice a week I play pickup basketball, once a week I play pickup soccer, and I'm a calmer, better father. I'm a husband, sibling, person in general because of those benefits. And it was completely outrageous when they shut down gyms, when they told people to stay home and eat the processed foods we talked about, when we prevented kids from being around other children. And all these high risk people, I mean, think about it, we're in 2022. If these high risk people, I can already feel myself getting worked up just talking about this. But all these high risk people, and people like, you've been around this much longer than I have, and you're an expert. I'm not. I'm just a big fan of your work and people like yourself, and try to extract some of the wisdom from you. But some people who have been in the health and nutrition and world of exercise, the idea of we're protecting people's health by punishing them, by not being around other social creatures, by not being around other germs, and helping our immune system, which I think is important too, by shutting down gyms, not exercising, telling people to stay at home, and telling them one size fits all, that all these high risk people, if they had 2 years to now be low risk people, if we talked about health and nutrition and exercise, and instead of every doctor and expert on TV discussing only the one solution, and we know what that is, talking about all the other solutions, and saying, hey, we know that people who are obese, there's something about the fat cells that put you at higher risk. Let's work on not being obese. Let's work on maybe by the time you get it, you go from obese to being a healthy person, average weight, and then you won't be high risk. Like, because you're in this world and you were seeing this all play out, and you were doing, I mean, I know that you were giving out electrolyte, your stuff to first responders and all that stuff, which I think is awesome, because any help, I mean, they really are the people we should be proud of, and really be inspired by, because when everybody was confused and people didn't know what the hell to believe, they still went to work and they had to do what they had to do. And, when shit hits the fan, a lot of us believe we would step up. But believe me, I saw a lot of cowards being exposed, and I saw a lot of people who were heroes that you would never think could step up. So I think both deserve their praises. But what was your thoughts on all this, being a health, because this really was a health issue? What was your thoughts? How did you perceive the way they were, I guess, suggesting getting healthier or preventing us from getting sick? Like, just what are your thoughts on it in general? I know it's kind of a general question, but
Yeah.
I just want to get a feel of, while this was playing out, knowing your background and your understanding of health and nutrition and all this stuff, did it seem unusual to tell people to not exercise, stay home, and eat snacks?
Yeah. Well, I'll try to get to that, but what I want to do is kind of like a timeline of what my evolution was on this whole thing. So, like, I think it was January. God, and the years run together. I guess it was 2020. Was it 2000 or end of 2019? I guess going into 2020. Is that right? Yeah, I guess so. God, this fucking it's just all like blends together. But we were in Costa Rica, and this was end of February, beginning of March. We're heading home, and we were there for a jiu-jitsu seminar. And I had been hearing about this, this outbreak in China, and I followed the SARS one and MERS outbreaks pretty closely, because I'm a biochemist. I'm not a virologist, but I've in the back of my head, I think about existential threats, like what's something that could destroy civilization as we know it, and like EMP pulse, an electromagnetic pulse, either generated by a nuclear weapon or multiple nuclear weapons, or coronal mass ejection from the sun. That would be a super shitty day. It would basically bring us all back to, like, 18th century technology in the blink of an eye. That'd be a bad day. comet impact, super volcano eruption, and pandemic. Like these are things that's kind of like, and so I just kind of have, a little bit of CPU cycles out in the, the news, just kind of like what's, where are the winds blowing on this stuff? So I had been following the stuff, and it's like, okay, Wuhan, and there's this respiratory virus. Oh shit, respiratory viruses can be bad. It's like the flu. It transmits very easily. I was a big fan of Stephen King's The Stand, which is a phenomenal book, which talks about the end of the world via a bioengineered super flu that gets out of a lab, and ironically. And so we were coming back from Costa Rica, and like we got back to the States just as everything started really locking down. I think it was like March 6th or something like that, and we got in, and like everything started really boom, 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 locking down. And we were still living in Texas at the time. We live in Montana now. And as this stuff started spinning up, one thing that I knew, like SARS-1 has like a 30% infection fatality rate. So if you get it, 30% of people die. The 70% who don't die are really, really sick. It's not, oh, maybe I was sick, maybe I was kind of asymptomatic. It's like, no, you're fucking laid out. Like SARS-1 is nasty. The thing that we have going for us with SARS-1 and MERS is similar, is that it's very, very, very difficult to transmit. And usually this is the trade-off within infectious disease. If it's very easy to get, it's usually not super deadly. If it's really deadly, it's usually not that easy to transmit, but not always. Like you can, like the 1918 flu pandemic, you can get something that has both. It's very easy to spread, and it ends up being remarkably deadly. So we got home, stuff started spinning up, and, it was like, oh, this stuff looks like it could be no joke, could be quite dangerous, could be, a couple of orders of magnitude worse than a standard flu. And when you start getting up to something that is potentially a 10% infection fatality rate, so when 10% of the people that get it, if 100 people get it, 10 people die, you are knocking right at the door of a civilization-ending event. Not because everybody dies from that, but because enough people no longer can drive trucks. Enough doctors and police officers can no longer do their thing. Enough people are peripherally sick. It's just this knock-on effect. And we saw this, and this, I don't know what they will say that COVID's ultimate infection fatality rate is, and we won't really know because they've fucked with all the information, so it's almost impossible to know, which is a crime in and of itself. But it's probably, when it was at its worst, it might have been like 3%. It's probably somewhere between like 1 and 3% legitimate infection fatality rate, and even that is highly, highly variable. The median age of death is 80 years old. That means half of the people that have died are older than the age of 80. And in general, life expectancy is somewhere around like 76 to 78. And no, I don't want old people to die, but when you get old enough at some point, like the wind blowing the wrong way is going to kill you. Just your degree of resilience is gone, and something's going to get you. But at the beginning of this thing, I took it very, very seriously. My wife and I, we were fortunate to live in Texas. We had some property. We could go walk around the property and, take the kids on a bike ride and wave to the neighbors. And, everybody was doing their social distancing thing. And my wife and I had conversations about like, well, if I die, here's what we're going to do. If my wife dies, here's what she's going to do. We had an estate plan in all set up. If we both died, then the kids went to these people. If one of the kids died, we did this. So we took this, I want to lay this out, is like, I took it really fucking seriously, because what I'm going to get into, there's going to be a tendency for people to be like, oh, you're a vaccine denier. And it's like, oh, fuck you. No, I was really scared. And I was scared because I'm educated enough in the science to know just what a pickle we could have been in. A lot of the people that are going bananas, they didn't know how fucked or unfucked we really were. Like, they didn't actually have enough information I sound like a dick saying that, but like, I knew enough to have like that stool loosening effect of like, oh, this could be a civilization ending event. But then it started going forward. We had, like the Princess cruise ship where, everybody was quarantined on the ship. I was like, well, shit, did everybody die? No, not everybody died. And it looked like mainly the old people died. There were a few younger people, but the younger people had 3 or 4 comorbidities, comortality, and it ended up, when we look back at what happened on that Princess cruise ship, it was a fractal representation of the whole goddamn thing. Young people had no problem. People with multiple comorbidities had serious problems. Blood sugar, weight, hypertension were all serious, problems within this thing. And even in a enclosed environment like on this cruise ship, not everybody appeared to get it, or if they did all get it, it was so mild for some people that it didn't end up being a problem. So that was interesting to me. And that was something that I was like, where are all the epidemiologists to look at this as a natural experiment for how we can extrapolate and model the real world? None of that happened. Instead, we got all this information out of the Imperial College of London that like 60 million people were going to die globally. And, it was going to be 10 million people in the US and this many people in Great Britain. And immediately...
And that was from Ferguson, who got caught going to his mistress's house during the lockdown.
Yeah, it was so dangerous that he had to go get some trim on the side, so that started getting suspicious. But where it really got suspicious for me, and again, talking about the existential threats, this actually kind of loops back around to that. Where I really started getting super incredulous about this stuff was our solution out of this is a vaccine. And that was the one thing that was said. And I had studied this stuff enough that there had been attempts for SARS and MERS vaccines in the past, and none of them had worked. They all killed the animals. They killed the animals via antibody-dependent enhancement, and original antigenic sin, and some of these kind of complications that are inherent in dealing with these types of viruses. So I was like, the one solution that we have is a vaccine and a class of viruses, or for a class of viruses that we've never had a successful vaccine for. And people will, scoff at that. HIV, we still don't have a fucking vaccine for it. We may be close to it now, but that emerged in the 1980s. It is still a global problem. We have managed it, ironically, with pharmaceuticals, and some of these pharmaceuticals were known drugs that had protease inhibition activity that ended up having benefit for HIV. So, it was just so weird. It's like a vaccine is the only answer we have in a class of things that we've never had successful, vaccines before. And that was, the focus was really weird to me. And then the things that weren't being discussed, there was no like Manhattan Project for looking at what are the drugs that we have that could be used to improve treatment and improve outcomes for people. There was nothing. The only thing that you heard about was like hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, eventually fluvoxamine. And it was all this stuff that was immediately vigorously suppressed, any discussion about. And the United States, so people will rail about this. Or like, oh, it was all, bullshit and, conspiracy theory. And it's like, okay, well, it would have been super easy. The United States is the most powerful, most sophisticated, country on the planet. We could have conducted randomized control trials, gold standard randomized control trials, to prove unequivocally one way or another whether this stuff was bullshit or not. And we did nothing. All of the information we have on all these other drugs have been done in other countries under really dubious circumstances. And so that was a problem. What was really weird about that is this was being presented again as an existential threat, like nuclear war, like a super volcano eruption that creates a global, ice age or something like that. During the Manhattan Project, and if people don't know what the Manhattan Project was, it was during World War II when a bunch of physicists were enlisted to develop an atomic bomb, because we knew that the Germans were trying to develop a nuclear weapon. And it was still theoretical. We didn't know if it could be done. We didn't know if it would work. But if it could be done, it represented the ability to destroy civilization. And it was like whoever develops the atomic weapon, wins the war, basically. And Philip K. Dick has a alternate history timeline, The Man in the High Castle, in which the Germans developed the atomic bomb first. Doesn't go well for the world, you know? So in that Manhattan Project, we were so scared about getting this right that people were broken up into multiple teams. There wasn't a one-size-fits-all approach to that, because nobody had ever developed this goddamn thing before. Nobody had developed an atomic bomb. So there were people that thought that plutonium was the way to go, and there were other people that thought that uranium was the way to go. And some people felt that, like, part of the problem was that you had to ram this fissile material together in a certain way. Some people thought that the shape charge that needed to enact needed to be smooth. Some people thought it should look like a golf ball with these divots in it. Nobody knew. And you couldn't just do one. So you had to have multiple teams sharing information, but all competing against each other, because literally the survival of the world hinged on this outcome. And we managed to do it. And not only did the uranium bomb work, but also the plutonium bomb worked. And you know, history is what it is. We didn't do a fucking thing like that with COVID. Not one thing. We didn't repurpose drugs. It's been a shit fight the whole way to talk about, you know, early treatment methodologies, and you know, Malone. You've had Malone and all these guys on, so like you've already done the deep dive on all that type of stuff. But those are the things that developed deep skepticism on my part about all of this, when they weren't approaching this. If it really was an existential threat, then you approach it like an existential threat. And that means you pull out all the stops, you do all the stuff. The other thing, naturally acquired immunity. Why are we not documenting who has naturally acquired immunity and heat mapping that, so that we, you know, so who would have been the perfect person to go into a care home to take care of old people so that the old people don't get exposed to COVID? Somebody who already had COVID. Because even during the vaccine trials, we knew that the vaccines were leaky. We knew that the vaccines were non-sterilizing. But we were almost certain that people didn't get reinfected with COVID. Although with the Omicron variant, that changed because it was different enough that the Alpha and the Delta variants didn't really apply there. But the fact that there was not only no effort put into repurposed drugs, but there was actual suppression. The fact that we didn't track any of the natural immunity stories, the fact that any information around improving your health, like on day one, Fauci could have been in, like, so we've been told multiple like noble lies, you know, like masks work, masks don't work. One of the noble lies is, hey, if you lose some weight and get your vitamin D levels up, you're gonna likely manage this thing better. And the irony there is, whether you want to be vaccinated or not vaccinated, if you want your vaccine to work, if you are metabolically unhealthy and have low vitamin D, the vaccine does not work well. So this works whether you're in the vaccine camp or the not vaccine camp. Where has the public health messaging been around getting metabolically healthy? One interview in which somebody said, well, Dr. Fauci, is health important? He's like, of course health is important. People should get healthy. You know, so I mean, I don't want to go too much on, because you've had people who are much better experts on this stuff than me, but that was my progression of going from, this is an existential threat and I'm making like end of life plans, legacy plans for my family in case I or members of my family die, to the point that I'm like, I don't believe a goddamn thing that any of these people say. I think it's all a lie. The lab leak deal, has been completely a sham. And so now I'm at this point where I try to remain open to the facts as they come, but it's almost like I would need a 10-to-1, fact signal coming out of like the World Health Organization or what have you to change my mind on everything. I hold all of it so suspect now because of this inconsistency all the way along. So that I know I didn't really answer much of the question, but just contextually though, like, I'm a biochemist. I was a researcher. I started off thinking that this was like really, really bad. And clearly it's been bad, but it's been made worse because of the way it's been handled. It hasn't been mitigated because of it. This could have been such a less negatively impactful thing on the planet and on society and on kids And I think it's because at the end of the day, their main goal is this vaccine and the vaccine passport, and all of that getting wrapped up into this like social credit score thing is what I think that the main ultimate goal is.
Well, I think I've had people on, like you said, Dr. Robert Miller, Dr. Pierre McCullough, Dr. Pierre Corey, but your expertise, I think, is important too, and where you can shine a light on that maybe they can't, being in the health and nutritional world, is how quote unquote experts can get people to accept bad information, and the power of propaganda. You see it in food. Like you said, you talk to the average person, they think high fat diets lead to heart attacks. They think that you shouldn't eat any, you should minimize all salt from your diet, even though it's essential mineral, more or less. So when I was growing up, the food pyramid was all grains. You're feeding kids, you're teaching kids how to eat incorrectly. I mean, like I always say, you see fat parents, you usually see fat kids, because the kids are a product of their environment. You're not born knowing how to eat. You adopt the way your parents eat. And also, obviously they buy the groceries and stuff. So you see it in food, how bad information based on bad science can be pushed and then accepted and be pushed by quote unquote experts. So there's parallels there, because it's the same thing. Like you're told that like this is all, the science is settled, with food, or the science is settled with and then you start dissecting and you're like, no, there's people who actually disagree with this, and there's good research that argues this, and that's true in medicine, that's true in nutrition and health, and it's not one size fits all in any of these topics. But when you look at, like, I've had Jim Abrams on, from the Charlie Foundation.
Yeah.
His story, and I've sorry for people who've heard this story over and over again. When I had him on, I thought the story was so important to share with the listeners, because he was a guy, top filmmaker at his time. Some of my favorite movies back in the day, Naked Gun was hilarious, and he had all the resources. His doctors were telling him like these prescription drugs were the only thing that, the only possible solution to save his child from these violent seizures he was having. And then doing his own research, he finds out that there's some success with the ketogenic diet, and starts the Charlie Foundation to look more into it after basically saving his child of these violent seizures using a dietary method. So the reason why that story is important is because most people go to the doctor and they see the white coat, they see the PhD, and they assume if he's not telling you there's a solution, a dietary solution or any other solution that he's not presenting to you, it must not work, it must not exist, it must be bullshit. And his story is important because it's like, it obviously wasn't. And they don't have all the answers. And I'm pretty sure I've heard you talk about this too. I know I've heard Chris Kresher talk about it, and others, about how sometimes the research, by the time it gets implemented in university, and the university gets taught to a person who becomes a future doctor, and it gets suggested to the patient, like they're way behind, right? And that's an issue too. And then you look at all the other things, like you look at, you talked about the Manhattan Project. One thing I love is history. Well, look at the history of Dr. Fauci and AZT, pushing that. The Dallas Buyers Club, the guy who did that film, one of his influences to do that film was Dr. Fauci in the 80s. You look at Dope Sick, right? A great series I keep telling people to watch, because I think people need to see the parallels of like history. I forget who says it, like history might not always repeat, but it rhymes.
Yeah.
And it's like it's true. You look at it, like there's parallels. There's so much that goes on behind the scenes. And to think that humans, regardless if they have a PhD and they're a doctor or they're an expert, or if they're whatever they may be in their careers, like that they don't have possible agendas or egos or money motivations that might sway them in one direction or the other, is absolutely silly. And we see it in all aspects of life. It doesn't matter if you're a politician or you're in medicine or whatever. Like, humans are flawed, and flawed humans will do not so moral things. And when there's so much money and influence in medicine and research, I mean, look at Dr. What's his name, Peter Duesberg. He was on Rogan's podcast way back in the day, and I think it was like episode 280 something, and he was a very respected doctor, and once he starts being outspoken about, and so his and I don't know if he's right or wrong, but I entertain everything. I like to, like, hey, if somebody's going against the grain, I'm intrigued. Like, why do you think this? What's your, what's your opinions? And let's challenge and hear new ideas. He had this theory that the HIV virus didn't cause AIDS, right?
Right.
And pissed off Dr. Fauci. He referenced Dr. Fauci in that podcast with Rogan before anybody even knew who he was, and
Right.
talked about how all his grants, stopped, basically like ruined his career. And he was a highly respected guy, all because he just had this one theory. And I believe there was an article in like Spin magazine about it that kind of gave it some attention. He talked about Carrie Mullis, who created the PCR test, in that interview also, and how he didn't like Dr. Fauci and all this stuff. And but his story, I had Dr. Brzezinski on years ago. He's from Texas. And same thing. When I had Dr. Brzezinski on in 2013 or 2014, I just started my podcast, and I remember watching his documentary, and he talked about how they have people who go out and demonize anybody who will, talk to this guy, like just say that he's pseudoscience, that he's a murderer, all this stuff. And I'm like, wow, that's crazy. And then I had him on. He was one of my first like big guests I had on, and I was really excited to have him on and share his story. And I don't know if maybe I was still on MySpace at the time. Who knows what social media platform I was on at the time? But I had all these like fake accounts attacking me, saying he's a murderer, he's all, and I'm like looking into it. I'm like, this isn't even a real account. And I'm like, I just started podcasting. I don't even have an audience yet. Like,
Right.
they're going to this extreme to demonize this guy. And it really put in perspective, like, the power of Big Pharma. And I was motivated during that, like, I really got involved in like history and current events during the Iraq war, because I was like this anti-war, like, oh my God, the military industrial complex, like Eisenhower warned us, like, it's the most powerful thing and it's the most dangerous thing to humanity. And then always being into health, nutrition, and exercise, I'm like, Big Pharma, I got to keep an eye out on them, because they're becoming much more influential.
Pharmaceutical industrial complex may make the military industrial complex pale by comparison.
Absolutely.
Because it really is global. And I mean, we have, at least still now, some buffers against the military industrial complex coming and sitting on our chests here at home. And, to what degree you can go unleash that around the world. But we now have, so we went, and I have to shake here in a couple of minutes. I really enjoy chatting. You have a fantastic show, but within about a year and a half time, there's a cross section of people that shifted from healthcare is a right to, if you don't take this one therapeutic, you are subhuman. You shouldn't have access to healthcare. Maybe you shouldn't have access to food, and shit, maybe you should just be killed outright because you're dangerous to humanity at large. And that's amazing. Like, that is nothing short of amazing. And just I wanted to circle back and kind of lend some weight to some of what you were saying earlier. So there's something that I remember hearing all the time, and you never hear anymore. You go to your doctor gives you a diagnosis or, a prognosis or whatever. And then what does that doctor tell you? What was like part of their moral obligation to say? Seek out a second opinion. Seeking out a second opinion at this point is paramount to being unpatriotic, like you're un-American, even though being American is a horrible thing, because America is this horrible place now. But part of that is that because we've made medicine formulaic, it's a flow chart. Doctors aren't by and large scientists anymore. Your symptoms fall within these prescribed categories, and this is the flow chart, because this is how we get the insurance reimbursement around this stuff. And this is also why modern medicine fails complex chronic degenerative diseases for a lot of reasons. But part of the story there is that because they're complex and degenerative, the pharmaceutical approach is never going to fix them. Like, it's just, you're never going to properly address type 2 diabetes with a pill. It's kicking a can at the best circumstances. But if all of your symptomology doesn't exactly fit within these categories, then you're not sick. You know, if your anti-nuclear antibodies are just a little bit above what would diagnose you as rheumatoid arthritis, well, you don't have rheumatoid arthritis. You have to hit this threshold. Otherwise, it doesn't trigger the insurance reimbursement to go through all this stuff. And what's super dangerous about that is that the only things that will be treatable or manageable will be what is formulaic as dictated by the pharmaceutical plus insurance industries. And so what has blown my mind is, and I really do need to shake, I apologize, but there are people in this ancestral health, kind of alternative health space that have gone hook, line, and sinker into the COVID narrative who don't believe at all in like the kind of mainstream medical thing. I mean, if you get shot or you get hit by a bus, yeah, you go do emergency medicine, but they understand that for chronic degenerative disease, that's not going to address things, but yet they've gone whole hog into this other angle of disease management, which has no nuance, really no scientific investigation. It's just dictate from up on high, and you take it, and that's it.